In 1985, Dr. Gregory Stock struck gold with this #1 New York Times bestseller simply titled The Book of Questions. Over 1 million copies sold. All it is, 200 thought-provoking questions. That's it. So I thought we'd start today by discussing one of the questions. What I need from you is a number between 1 and 200. And I'm really hoping that you choose a number that corresponds with an appropriate G-rated question. So let's see how this goes. Just yell out some number. 22. I heard 22. All right, here we go. I think this is okay. Okay, but thank you for 22. If you could choose a voodoo doll to hurt anyone you choose, would you? So it doesn't ask who would that be, okay? It's just if you could do harm to somebody, we'll leave the voodoo language out of it. If you could do harm to somebody, would you? Okay, now remember, you're in church, so I guess on this question, there is a right or a wrong answer. First service, we had a question that was split 50-50 down the middle when I asked for hands. So take just a moment, turn to the person next to you, and discuss that question. Okay? And as you're talking, go ahead and start. I'm going to quickly address our live stream audience and people who are joining us via Loma Linda Broadcasting Network. We're so glad that you are here. If you're with somebody right now, go ahead, discuss that question, all right? If you're by yourself watching this, then go ahead and discuss it with yourself, because nobody cares to hear what you have to say more than you want to hear what you have to say. So go ahead and enjoy that little exercise. And I think we're ready to wrap things up here. All right. How many of you, by way of hands, said, yes, you would? Not an honest person anywhere. And we're in church. Okay, well, that's kind of the right answer, I suppose. So I feel like there are a lot of great questions in here, and I'd like to just go through the entire book. But we're not going to do this book of questions today. We're going to do another book of questions, which is Romans. We're working our way through the first 8 chapters of the book of Romans in this 22-week series. There are over 70 questions in the book of Romans alone. Did you know that? Did you notice, as Sonny and Alex read through our passage today, just 8 verses, did you notice how many questions Paul raises just in that short passage? And we're going to look at that together. And since they gave us an overview in reading it, now we will go and synthesize the 8 verses into 4 primary questions that Paul poses and he answers. Now, if you have your outline, that will be helpful as I try to make these questions as simple as possible. Question number 1. Paul asks, is there any advantage to biblical religion? It's in verse 1. Now, of course, he's addressing the Jewish community of faith specifically, but he asks, is there any advantage to being a Jew, to keeping all of these laws? I get asked that question, or a variation of the question often, where people will wonder, so why be a Seventh-day Adventist? Or is there any advantage to being Methodist or Mormon? And does it really matter? Paul answers specifically to the Jewish community of faith, yes. Verse 2, there is great value in having and knowing the words of God. I like the answer that he gives to his own question from the King James Version, where he asks, is there any advantage to being a part of the Jewish faith? He says, much every way, chiefly because that unto them, that is, unto the Jews, were committed the oracles or the 10 commandments of God. Well, of course, as Seventh-day Adventists, we too embrace, teach, observe all 10 of the commandments. And so, is there any advantage in teaching and keeping all 10 commandments? And Paul would answer, yes, whether it's in a Jewish context or a Seventh-day Adventist context, yes, great advantage in observing the boundaries that God has given his people, because it just makes life and relationships work so much better. It allows you to explore the thrill of life, right? They did an incredible study where researchers were looking at children. And they had around the playground, in one set, they had a fence around the playground. And they discovered that these children were not inclined to leave the playground area, the actual toys that they were playing on, right? And then they did the same experiment, except they, I don't know why I'm feeling so lightheaded all of a sudden. I don't know, yeah, maybe, can I get a glass of water? Did the same experiment, thank you. And they put, whoa, all right, yeah, that water makes a difference. Okay, here we go. So, first experiment had fences. Second experiment did not have fences, or vice versa. Anyway, what they discovered was that when they had fences, the kids explored all of the space. They went all the way out to the boundaries. Without the fences, they stayed close to the playground equipment, leading researchers to conclude this. The overwhelming conclusion was that there was, with a given limitation, children felt safer to explore a playground. With a boundary, in this case the fence, the children felt at ease to explore all of the space. In other words, ironically, fences brought freedom. That the kids were open to exploring if they understood the boundary. Well, if you think about the 10 Commandments, which is what Paul's talking about here in verse 2, as boundary markers for God's people, again, it allows his children to explore the fullness of life. And so I choose to think of the 10 Commandments not so much as rules that we must keep or behaviors that we must embrace, but rather benefits. If we live within these fences that God has given to us, we will enjoy optimum life. So I have rewritten the 10 Commandments, except I call them 10 benefits. Just think about the 10 Commandments and the benefits of keeping each one. Commandment number 1, you are relieved of the burden of running the universe. That's a heavy-duty responsibility. But if you just observe the first commandment, you don't have to worry about running the universe. Number 2, you don't have to worship a pitiful little God like yourself. It's an enthusiastic amen over there. Number 3, your words will build up rather than destroy. Yeah, it's just a better way to do relationships. There's a benefit in observing these commandments from God. Number 4, now we all know and love the 4th commandment, don't we? You'll have less stress in your life. Number 5, you'll live longer. Number 6, you'll stay out of jail for committing crimes like murder. Number 7, you'll keep your marriage strong. Number 8, you'll sleep better knowing everything you got honestly. Number 9, you'll have improved relations with your neighbors. Number 10, you will enjoy what you have. There are great benefits to observing God's laws. So when Paul asks himself the question, is there any benefit to obeying God's commandments, to being a part of a biblical community of faith? He answers emphatically, yes. Question number 2, does our faithlessness cancel out the faithfulness of God? In other words, even though there are all of these advantages of keeping God's 10 commandments, everybody knows that we are often faithless and unable to observe all of these laws. So Paul wonders, since we compromise on these commandments anyway, is there any reason? Because we can't keep all of them. He answers, verse 4, notice, he says, absolutely not. That our faithlessness does not cancel out the faithfulness of God. Even though we still continue to break the commandments, we lie and we steal. You notice verse 4, he says, if every person on the planet were a liar and a thief, God would still be true. God is still faithful. He is still true. His character is still good, even though we are so often faithless. Were any of you in church last week by way of hands? Okay, do any of you remember the game that we played in church? Spin the bottle. You're right. It was so much fun. So if you were not here last week, let this be a lesson. You should never miss church because you don't know how much fun you're going to miss out on. Am I right? Yeah. And one of the things that we discovered about one another last week is that all of us are liars and thieves. We lie whenever we check the box. I have read all the terms and conditions when, of course, we haven't. And we steal every time we take a few sips and then refill the soda without paying extra for it. I mean, we're all liars and thieves. And I find it interesting that Paul specifically mentions these two things when he's talking about our faithlessness. And we are reminded again this week that that's all of us. We're all a hot mess, which leads now to the third question. If our sin, because we're all sinners and we're all liars and we're all thieves, if our sin showcases God's faithful forgiveness, how can he judge us for making him look good? You get the question, right? Paul's wondering, now wait a minute. If God looks good every time I sin, every time I lie, every time I steal, and he forgives me, and he looks so gracious and faithful, how is that a bad thing? And the answer Paul gives us, he says, using that twisted logic, God would not judge anyone in the world. And we all agree that God should, in fact, judge. We all want a fair day on that day of judgment, right? We all want a fair judge. And Paul says, if you just say, well, everybody's sinning so that they can make God look good, so in effect, your sinning is a good thing because after all, you're showcasing God's grace. He's saying, well, by that logic, then why would God judge anybody? And we all agree, right, that we want a fair judge. And only God is a fair judge on that day. And of course, this runs really deep in the human spirit. We all have this innate sense of justice. We crave fairness. So much so, if you go to a baseball game and an umpire makes an unfair call, he blows a call, we don't yell from the bleachers, "Send that umpire back to school so next time he can get the call right." What do we yell? Kill him. Yeah, doesn't that seem a little harsh? Kill the umpire. Kill him because he blew a call? Kill the umpire? It just goes to show how deep this sense of justice runs in all of us. And that's Paul's point. He's saying we all want a fair judge. And God is that fair judge. Question number 4. If then, by me sinning, God looks better, shouldn't I sin more so that God really looks good? You think about that question, but that's what he's asking, because some people were making that suggestion that every time I sin, God looks really good. So then, doesn't that give me permission to keep sinning? I think it's a little bit like this. Let me try this out on you. Suppose you would like to lose 10 pounds. I, as your pastor, want to help you in your quest for a svelte figure. So, I figure the best way for me to help you lose 10 pounds is if I were to gain, let's say, 400 pounds. So that every time you're with your pastor, you feel really good about your measly 10 pounds overweight. Because I would be 400 pounds overweight. And to get there, of course, I would just live inside of Grater's ice cream shop. And I would eat nothing but raspberry chip ice cream. Now, part of me really likes the thought of that. Apparently, some of you like the thought of that as well. Because I think, first off, it'd be great to just eat ice cream for every meal. I could do that. Moreover, I think it would be great that I could write off all of the expenses eating ice cream, because it would be a tax deduction, because I would just be doing it so that you don't feel 10 pounds overweight. It's the same kind of crazy logic that Paul puts out there to people who were saying, okay, well, then I'm just going to keep on sinning. In fact, I'm going to sin intentionally so that God looks really, really good. And Paul's basic answer is the mere notion of sinning more in order to show off God's grace is ridiculous. And anyone who makes such an argument, he says, will someday feel the fury of God. See, you're missing the whole point Paul's helping us to understand of faith. Because faith is not about just keeping all of the rules, even though there are great benefits, make no mistake, great benefits in keeping the rules of God and living within his boundaries. Of course, there are great benefits, but understand, that's not the essence of faith, rule keeping. The essence of faith is all about a relationship with the Father. You know, you think about the classic story of the prodigal son. When the kid comes home, the dad never mentions his bad behavior. He never says to his kid, "You broke all of the rules." The only thing that the father is obsessed with is restoring that kid back into the family. And so he does what? He throws the ring, the family ring, on his finger. He throws the family robe on his shoulders. And he says, "My son, who was lost, who was away from me." See, in the Father's paradigm, that's what sin is. It's being outside of the presence of the Father. My son who was lost, now he has come home. See, that's the Father's heart. That's what Paul, I think, is trying to get at. That faith is not about keeping all the rules in spite of the benefits. And when we think about, well, can I get away with this sin? Can I get away with that sin? And if I do, maybe I could rationalize it by saying, well, it just makes God look good. So what's wrong with that? No. The essence of faith, the Father's heart, is living in His presence. Being Father's Day weekend, thinking a lot about my dad, because this is the first Father's Day where I don't have my dad. And so this morning, as I was getting ready, a story came to mind that I thought, well, kind of impromptu. I'm going to throw that story in there because I think it does help us understand this teaching a little more. Back when I was quite young, my dad built me a skateboard because we were too poor to buy a legit skateboard. So he was quite good building things, and he did not pass that gene on to his oldest son, but he went to the Goodwill store and for 25 cents bought an old pair of roller skates. And he took the rollers from the skates and he put them to a board that he had cut out in the shape of a skateboard. And he said, have fun. The one rule, don't ride it on that steep, steep hill behind our house. Which, of course, made me want to ride it on that steep, steep hill behind our house. And so one summer afternoon, wearing nothing but sneakers and a pair of cut-off jeans, I snuck over to that street, got to the top of it, and started going down this very steep road. Within 5 seconds, I was doing Mach 10. It's funny what you remember. Even though this was nearly 50 years ago, long time ago, I still remember the song I was singing on that summer day. Any of you remember the song, "Da Do Run Run"? That's what I was singing. Don't know why. But it didn't take long, and I was flying down this street. Then I got to that tipping point where I realized I can't just jump off this skateboard. That will hurt. How am I going to slow down and stop? It didn't help. I could see down at the bottom of the street a very busy intersection with cars racing one way and the other. And I knew I was in trouble. Before I actually got to the intersection, I hit a patch of gravel and went face first, sliding down the hill, probably 5-10 yards. I don't know, it felt like 10 miles. Well, I broke my arm, and I had, shredded flesh all in the front of my body. I still, again, all these years later, I remember staggering home and seeing my dad out washing his car in our driveway. Immediately when he saw me, what do you suppose he did? I'll tell you what he didn't do. He did not say, "Why did you disobey me?" In fact, he never once brought up the fact that here I had broken his rule, which of course I had. I don't even know that crossed his mind. What I remember is he quickly scooped me up and said, "Oh no, we got to get you to the hospital." And they did. And they set my arm, and then they started the task of pulling gravel out of my chest. And finally, I remember the doctor saying, "This is hopeless. We will never be able to get all of the gravel out of your chest." So when I tell you I have a rock-hard chest, I am not kidding. I am serious. See, as a father, I understand that heart. It's not so much about the rules you break, but, the hurt that you experience as you learn, there are reasons for the boundaries. And if you live within the context, then your relationships with one another, your relationships with God, they just work out so much better. And that's what the Father wants. So to get all legalistic in our thinking, saying, well, how much can we sin and still get away with it? And how might we rationalize our behaviors to say, well, I'm just sinning, I'm just eating all this Grater's ice cream, to showcase God's grace. It's just the wrong way to think about faith and the law and the Father and the day of judgment. All of this passage really boils down to a simple point that Paul is making, where he is reminding us that whether we sin or not, and we all do, on the day of judgment, that ultimately God is true and God is faithful. Karl captures really, I think, the point of this whole passage. In a song she wrote, the chorus, "He's been faithful, faithful to me. Bring back his love and mercy I see. Though in my heart I have questioned, even failed to believe, he has been faithful, faithful to me." You may recognize the name Karl Cymbala. She and her husband Jim went to the Brooklyn Tabernacle many years ago. When they arrived, they found the church in disrepair. There were very few people who were attending. They were on the brink of closing their doors at the Brooklyn Tabernacle. It was a mess that they inherited. And Jim Cymbala said, "We are not going to base our success or failure on how many people are in attendance over the weekend, or how much money people give, or what kind of buildings we might build or renovations we might do. The only thing that we are going to use as the basis for our success or failure, how many people are coming to the midweek prayer meeting." That's the only thing they cared about. They said together, "We are going to make this place a house of prayer." And a few years ago, I got to check something off of my bucket list and attend a midweek prayer meeting at the Brooklyn Tabernacle. I found it fascinating because we really did not sing very much. There wasn't a sermon, but thousands of people packed into the tabernacle, and really all we did was we just prayed. That was it. Just connected with the Father in that way. It was powerful, just so powerful when the people of God come together to pray. Well, if you know anything about their story, you know that their one daughter really kind of mirrored the life of the prodigal child. She went to sow her wild oats. She never felt like she could be good enough. She never felt like she could live up to what people expected of a preacher's kid. And so she ran off, squandered all of her resources. At one point, she was homeless, made a serious mess out of her life. Eventually, she came back. Their daughter, Chrissy, came back to the church. She's currently very committed to faith and involved in ministry. But there was a long season when her parents wondered, will she ever come back to God? Will she ever come back to the family? Will she ever come back to this church? They wondered. Now, people just assume that her mom, Karl Cymbala, wrote this wonderful song of faithfulness of God after their daughter came back. That's not the case. She actually wrote the song in the middle of her daughter's journey away, never knowing whether or not Chrissy was ever going to come back to faith, never knowing what was going to happen with their daughter, but still being able to hang on and trust God through all of that. She's able to pin the words to a wonderful chorus. He's been faithful, so faithful to me. She could make that declaration. Hey, friends, no matter what questions we might have, no matter how often we lie or cheat or steal or covet or break the commandments of God, this one thing we can always know, that God is true. His character is good. He is always faithful to forgive. So don't you want to live in relationship with a Father like that?